Picture a normal workday where someone signs into a key business app in the morning, opens a few more tools by lunch, and never has to think about which tab is still logged in or which password goes where. That smooth feeling is not an accident. It depends on how well session management and single sign-on, SSO, are set up behind the scenes. In this Tuesday Insights feature from Bare Metal Cyber Magazine, we will explore how those quiet controls keep logins under control, reduce friction for real people, and shape the way attackers can move if they ever get in. At the core, session management and single sign-on are about how your systems remember that a user has already proven who they are and how long that trust should last. Session management describes the rules and mechanisms an application uses to keep track of an authenticated user across clicks, page loads, and API calls. Single sign-on builds on top of that idea by centralizing authentication in one identity service and letting many applications rely on it. Together, they form the bridge between raw authentication factors like passwords or passkeys and the actual business actions a user can perform once they are in. Think of a session as an ongoing conversation between a user and an application. At the start of the conversation, the user proves their identity, usually through a login prompt that might include multi-factor authentication. Once that proof is accepted, the application hands the user's browser a cookie or token that stands in for that proof on future requests. Instead of asking for credentials again and again, the app checks this session token and, if it is still valid, treats the user as authenticated. Session management is everything that happens around that token: how it is created, where it is stored, how long it lives, and how it is revoked when something goes wrong. Single sign-on changes where that initial proof happens. Instead of each application handling its own passwords, you point users to a central identity provider that specializes in authentication. When a user tries to reach an application, the app redirects them to the SSO service. The user signs in there, often with multi-factor, and the SSO system issues a signed statement about who they are and what groups or roles they belong to. The application validates that statement, creates its own local session, and from that point on, the user moves around without re-entering credentials. The more you lean on SSO, the more your login story becomes sign in once, move around with guardrails. In the stack, these controls live firmly in the identity and access layer. On the technology side, you have an identity provider, or SSO service, web or cloud applications that trust it, and the protocols that carry identity information back and forth. Inside each app, you have a session store and logic that decides when to accept a request as from this user. On the process side, you have decisions about idle timeouts, absolute lifetimes, re-authentication prompts for sensitive actions, and what to do when someone leaves the company. On the people side, you have user expectations around Remember Me, shared computers, and the constant tension between convenience and caution. It is also helpful to be clear about what these concepts are not. Session management is not the same as password management. It does not store or fill in credentials. It governs the period after a successful sign-in. SSO is not simply one password that unlocks everything. It is a trust framework where one service does authentication and other applications accept its decisions. They are closely related to broader identity and access management, but do not replace the need for good authorization design, role reviews, and least privilege. When you cut through the buzzwords, session management and SSO are about controlling authenticated presence over time, not just saying yes or no at the front door. Under the hood, a modern SSO flow usually starts when someone tries to open an application that has been configured to trust an external identity provider. Instead of presenting its own login page, the application sends the user's browser over to the SSO service. The user enters their credentials, completes any multi-factor challenge, and, if successful, the SSO system records an SSO session of its own. It then returns a signed token or assertion to the application, which validates it and creates a local session tied to that user. From then on, each request from the browser carries a session cookie or token instead of raw credentials. From the user's perspective, everything after the first sign-in feels almost magical. They might click into a different application that also trusts the same SSO provider. The browser carries its existing SSO session. The provider sees that it is still valid and silently issues a fresh token to the second application. The user never sees a password prompt, but the security rules still run under the surface. The SSO layer has its own session lifetime and idle timeout, while each application can apply its own shorter timeouts or extra checks around particularly sensitive actions, like changing payroll details or resetting other people's passwords. A simple end-to-end story makes this concrete. A user signs in to an SSO portal at the start of the day, and the browser stores an SSO session cookie. The user then opens a customer relationship management tool. That tool redirects to the SSO provider, which sees the active session and issues a token asserting the user's identity and official group memberships. The tool verifies the token, creates its own session cookie with its own lifetime, and lets the user work. Later, the security team needs to revoke access because of a suspected compromise. They disable the account in the central directory and, if needed, actively clear SSO sessions. As tokens expire and applications recheck the user's status, access falls away without having to touch each system by hand. In everyday life, teams lean on SSO to calm down login sprawl. As organizations adopt more cloud services, admin consoles, and internal portals, the number of separate sign-in prompts can explode. By making SSO the default entry point for as many applications as possible, you reduce the number of passwords people remember and the number of risky workarounds they invent. Good session management then shapes how long that trust lasts between prompts and when it is appropriate to ask again. Together, they influence whether the environment feels seamless and safe or frustrating and brittle. One practical quick win is to start by bringing a handful of high-value systems behind SSO with consistent session settings. For example, you might start with email, the ticketing system, and the virtual private network portal. You set clear idle timeouts, require multi-factor authentication on sign-in, and define how long an SSO session can exist before a new login is required. Even this limited scope can sharply cut the number of password reset calls, give you a single place to revoke access when someone leaves or a device is lost, and improve your visibility through unified sign-in logs. Over time, more strategic patterns emerge. Teams start to use information from the SSO token, such as group membership or attributes, to drive authorization decisions inside applications. Sensitive admin portals might require a fresh authentication step if the SSO session is older than a certain age, or if the sign-in comes from a new device or unusual location. Finance and HR systems might demand stronger factors or shorter sessions than general collaboration tools. In these deeper uses, SSO and session management become core building blocks for identity-first security and even broader zero-trust style approaches, rather than isolated conveniences. When these controls are implemented well, the benefits stack up on both sides of the fence. Users sign in less often, experience fewer lockouts, and can move between tools more smoothly, which reduces frustration and the temptation to reuse passwords or write them down. Security teams gain a central point to enforce multi-factor, set baseline password policies, and track access patterns through a single set of locks instead of chasing data across many separate systems. Help desks see fewer routine issues related to forgotten credentials, and incident responders have clearer timelines when they need to reconstruct who accessed what. The trade-offs show up in more than just license costs. Standing up an SSO service, integrating many different applications, and tuning session lifetimes requires a mix of identity, networking, and web application skills. Not every team has that depth right away. There is also cultural change to manage. People notice when timeouts become stricter, when they have to complete multi-factor authentication more often, or when a new portal becomes the required starting point for daily work. If these changes arrive without communication, training, or a chance to give feedback, they can feel like obstacles instead of improvements. It is also important to remember what session management and SSO cannot fix. They do not automatically correct bad identity data, such as users sitting in the wrong groups or overly broad roles that grant more access than needed. They cannot fully compensate for missing logging, weak endpoints, or risky third-party integrations. A compromised account with too much access can still cause serious damage, and SSO can make it easier for an attacker to move quickly if that account is not locked down. Seeing these limits clearly keeps expectations realistic and encourages teams to treat SSO as one layer in a larger security design. Many of the most common failure modes trace back to misaligned settings and unclear ownership. One warning sign is a patchwork of session behaviors across your applications, where some never seem to log out and others prompt people again every few minutes without a clear pattern. Another is the absence of any named owner for SSO policies, token lifetimes, and timeout rules, which often leaves everything stuck on whatever defaults were chosen during the initial rollout. In those environments, no one is regularly asking whether those settings still make sense as the business and threat landscape change. Another pattern of shallow adoption is a kind of dashboard theater, where teams can display impressive graphs of SSO and sign-in data, but rarely use them to drive action. Repeated failed logins against sensitive systems, clusters of sign-ins from unusual regions, or a pile of very long-lived sessions might get collected but not analyzed. You may also see SSO used only for a handful of obvious tools, while administrators still maintain local accounts with separate passwords for critical consoles or back-end systems. In those cases, the SSO footprint covers the visible tip of the iceberg, leaving a large attack surface untouched. Healthier environments look and feel different. There is a clear, documented set of session policies that security and business owners understand and can explain in plain language. Idle and absolute lifetimes for major applications follow a consistent logic, even if they are not identical. Central SSO logs are not just stored, but consulted during investigations, routine reviews, and hygiene checks, like hunting for unused accounts or unusual access patterns. Incident playbooks include explicit steps to revoke active sessions and tokens, so containment actions do not stop at disabling usernames. Over time, as more applications are integrated with SSO and local admin passwords are retired, people across the organization start to see staying signed in as a controlled, intentional state. Product teams, identity engineers, and security operations staff talk to each other about how session behavior feels from a user perspective and how it appears in monitoring tools. When those conversations become normal, you are more likely to catch broken timeout logic, overly permissive tokens, or risky remember me configurations before they turn into incidents. At its heart, session management and single sign-on are about treating each login as an ongoing, time-bound relationship rather than a single gate you pass once and forget. They turn one authentication event into a controlled window of access, with the ability to shorten that window when risk increases or revoke it altogether when something goes wrong. When you adopt that mental model, decisions about timeouts, reauthentication prompts, and revocation paths become more grounded and easier to explain to both technical and non-technical stakeholders. With that perspective in mind, it becomes natural to look at your own environment and ask how those living conversations are being handled today. Where do sessions quietly linger long after they should have expired? Where is access revocation slow or manual? Where do inconsistent login experiences drive people towards unsafe shortcuts? Small, focused improvements to SSO coverage, session lifetimes, and revocation steps can then be framed not as abstract policy work, but as concrete changes to the way people experience security every day, and the way defenders contain incidents when they happen. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.